IVM.
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Rachita.
Welcome to Paperback by the Open Library Project.
We have as our guest today Arun Kale, founding editor of Helter, Skelter. In this episode, we deep dive into Technically Wrong by Sara Wachter-Boettcher.
In the second half, we also discuss The Art of the Publisher by Roberto Calasso, Steering the Craft by Ursula K Liguin, No Logo by Naomi Klien, and The Expo Files by Stieg Larsson.
Our conversation with Arun revolves around how technology is picking up sloppy thinking, sexist stereotypes, and unchecked biases, the publishing industry, tips on how to write better, articles on racism, violence against women, and the rise of branding and changes in labor.
Let's dig in.
Designers and technologists don't head into the office planning to launch a racist photo filter or build a sexist assumption into a database. So how do these alienating, unethical, and downright offensive decisions unfold over and over again? We can see a common example in the story of Fatima, a Middle Eastern American design strategist based in the Bay Area. A couple of years ago, Fatima was working at the Silicon Valley Innovation Center for a large corporation. The sort of startup-like lab you see associated with all kinds of big companies these days. Walmart, Volkswagen, and Capital One all have them. These centers are meant to generate new product ideas, experiment with emerging technologies, and ultimately build prototypes and products. It was 2015. The first Apple Watch had just arrived. Smartwatch sales were climbing, and Fatima's company wanted to get in on the action. It partnered with a major fashion brand with the goal of designing a women's smartwatch, something fashion-forward, to serve as an alternative to all the ugly wearables that tech companies were launching. As the project kicked off, Fatima sat down with the teams from both companies and was literally the only woman at the table. Pretty soon, someone started a video meant to show the product's positioning. It was all flash. Yacht parties, private jets, $2,000 shoes. Fatima cringed. The smartwatch they were designing was meant to target the mid-range market. Think Macy's, not Neiman Marcus. Let's wait until we get some research to make decisions, she said, trying to pull the kickoff session back on track. No one paid attention. Instead, she spent the next hour listening to older men tell her about the female market, using tales of their wives' shopping habits as proof. But Fatima didn't give up. She worked with a colleague from another office to develop an aggressive research program, gleaning insights from more than 1,000 people across the United States and in a couple of other prominent markets. Fatima then brought their findings back to the group. The team wanted to target women who are fashionable, tech-savvy, or both. About 2/3 of respondents were identified as the former, and half as the latter, except the men refused to believe Fatima. As soon as she started presenting her data, they wrote her off saying, "Oh, 51% of the women can't be tech-savvy." They were basically like, we're just going to categorically ignore the 30-something techie because that probably doesn't really exist. Even though based on our research, those were the people the most likely to buy the smartwatch and most likely to spend the largest amount of money on the smartwatch. The more she shared from the research findings, the more she was scoffed at. She described how the women in the research pool said that being able to discreetly stay on top of things during work meetings was critical. The men in the room insisted that most women really care about leisure time activities. She shared that women reported rarely using shopping apps on their phone. The men insisted their wives were always shopping, and the smartwatch absolutely needed an app for that. She reported that the women said functionality mattered to them, that if it didn't work well and fulfill a need, a fashionable design wouldn't be enough. The men insisted, oh, it doesn't really matter what tech we put in there. I felt like I was in an episode of Mad Men. Over and over, her ideas were discounted and her experience ignored. And as a result, the audience's actual needs, the ones identified and confirmed through her painstaking research, were discarded. That's a specific project, a physical piece of technology that would exist in the world or not based on whether these men in the room accepted what I had to say or not. They just weren't willing to accept the research and use it as a foundation. The project got shelved, and the brand partnered with a celebrity to design a smartwatch instead. It flopped. It wasn't based on needs, it was based on stereotypes, Fatima said. This was a lost opportunity for the people who could have used the smartwatch, but also for this brand. It was also a lost opportunity for the Innovation Center. Pretty soon, Fatima was tired of having her ideas ignored. She quit.
Thank you, Arun Kale. That was an excerpt from the book Technically Wrong by Sara Wachter-Boettcher. Welcome to Paperback by the Open Library Project. I am your co-host Satyajit, otherwise known as Onion Knight in most food circles. I am hosting this podcast with my co-founder at the Open Library Project, Racheta Sharma.
Hi guys, my name is Racheta and I'm an ex-banker who gave up my banking profession to follow my passion and run libraries across the world. The Open Library Project is a non-fiction book library service offered to businesses on a subscription basis. We're trying to move away from the run-of-the-mill library concept by setting up rotational and locational curated libraries at co-working spaces, corporates, and business incubators. The idea here is to create value, build a knowledge community, and encourage a growth mindset amongst our members.
Today we have with us on the show Arun Kale, founding editor of Helter, Skelter. He is also the founder of Astray.in, which does long-form interviews with creative people across disciplines. Helter, Skelter is an online magazine with a focus on independent and alternative culture in India. The scope of content includes films, books, theatre, food, music, art, and travel. Personal essays, social commentary, human interest pieces, interviews, features, reviews, photography, and lots more. They also publish an annual anthology in print of original artwork, poetry, and fiction from India. Welcome to the show, Arun.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me over.
So tell us a little bit about Helter Skelter and how did it start? How did your journey start there?
So I've been running Helter Skelter for about 8.5 years now.
Okay.
Before Helter Skelter, I used to run an indie music magazine for about 9 years.
Okay.
And after that, I kind of decided to branch out past just music into more like alternative culture in general.
Right.
In India, which is when Helter Skelter started.
So how has your journey been for the past 8 years?
It's been quite interesting. It's been a lot of fun. I've got to meet a lot of interesting people, both in terms of people creating content like writers and illustrators, and other people that I've met as part of the work for the magazine, and just seeing sort of how independent culture in the country is slowly evolving.
Right.
Over this period of time. Also, in 2012, we started publishing original short fiction and poetry from Indian writers.
Okay.
Which has also been like a really interesting experience. And that's just been growing every year.
So that's great to hear that Indian short fiction is taking off as so great.
Yeah, in fact, like there are a lot of book reviews on Helter Skelter that I read, which are very interesting. So very nicely, summarized, and it's really insightful for somebody who wants to pick up that book and read. So that's great work, yeah. And so we can possibly start with, talking about, like you mentioned from the excerpt, about how there is a lot of bias in the industry, especially the technical industry. Engineers are usually, men, and there is a lot of bias about how women users or women in that industry would be. So would you, want to share something that really stood out for you in this book? Or why you would recommend this to people?
So the full name of the book is Technically Wrong: Sexist Apps, Biased Algorithms and Other Threats of Toxic Tech.
Right.
I found this book super interesting because, for the past 6 years, I've also been sort of teaching at a college of graphic design, and I've been the program director for digital design in particular.
And that'll be a Institute, right?
Yeah, and I also do a lot of freelance projects and stuff within this space, both with respect to design and also programming and stuff. So I've seen a lot of these things happen. And more than anything, I think in the past 15 years, the way we evolved and where we are now, and our relationship to technology is such that it's just become super intimate, like we are willing to tell technology everything about us.
Right. Absolutely, yeah.
And a lot of these companies kind of make the wrong use of this kind of information.
Right.
And I think the sort of culture in these companies, as the excerpt sort of highlighted, is wrong. So like, even, for example, like even words like algorithm, which we almost use now on a daily basis.
Right.
Most people, if you ask them what an algorithm is, they won't be able to tell you.
Right.
But they can probably use it in a sentence, like Facebook's algorithm has changed.
Right.
Yeah.
So everyone uses these words, like Google's search algorithm has changed. But so the fact that no one understands this also helps these companies sort of put distance between themselves and their responsibility.
That's very
Right.
true. Yeah,
Right.
we're
So,
just
like, we didn't do
agreeing
this.
to everything. Yeah.
So I didn't do this, the algorithm did this.
Right.
But like, someone made the algorithm.
Right.
Like a human
So you're responsible.
person on the team made it. And I think even the way things like, all these terms have become super fashionable now, like machine learning, AI.
Yeah.
And while
Blockchain
everyone hears
technology.
and talks about this and reads about this, like, the thing is, everything starts from what has been programmed. So like an algorithm follows certain steps.
Right.
But those steps have been set by people.
Right.
And their own biases kind of show in that.
In the programming that they do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, like the book.
Which then now affects everyone because everyone is just relying on these technologies for everything from...
And the technologies are literally doubling down on the stereotypes
Exactly,
that we
yeah.
have inherited or I guess even gained over many years of living, and that's what's coming out.
Yeah. Like one thing computers are really good at is identifying patterns and
Right.
extrapolating from those patterns.
Right.
But they're not good at saying what is right and wrong.
That's where the
I mean,
human
if
aspect
there's some
would come in.
objective end of the calculation which they give you,
Right.
but whether that's right and wrong for society or for the users
for us to
is
say.
for the people making the app to decide that.
So the book also talks about how there's not enough diversity in the people making the decisions. That's why we are even susceptible to more and more of these stereotypes coming into our...
Exactly. I mean, I think it also comes down to the work culture
Right.
of a company and the people running the company.
Right.
And unfortunately, I feel like a lot of people working in tech and also digital design just see themselves as like super special in a way.
Okay.
And they feel like they're above
The rest
regular
of the-
people.
Yeah.
Because
Because
knowledge
they've
is...
constantly been told that they're super talented and they're special, and
Right.
so they have similar people around them all the time, and they just don't want to sort of move beyond that kind of bubble, I feel, a lot of times.
So what do you think the thought process behind, naming or rather having Alexa and Siri as women is like, what do you think the thought process is when they decide that it should be a woman doing it, or usually, it's a mother or a teacher or a wife doing the duties, so it should probably be a woman taking those instructions.
Yeah, quite possibly, I feel. I mean, I think with Siri, you can change the voice of the person speaking to you, but I don't think many people kind of do
Yeah,
that.
because it's default.
Yeah.
It's a woman's voice by default, yeah.
So technically they do have options to like change the location and change if it's a male voice or a female voice, but by default you're right. Like that's the thing also, that while a lot of apps may have options for things, like it's the default settings that most people use, and those kind of say a lot about
how
the
everything
company,
is being perceived,
yeah.
especially by the company. Yeah.
and their stance on things.
Right.
So before we go in for a short break, I just would want to know that, like you said, that the book mentions a lot about how personal information is being used by these apps or the biases that are there in the industry. So who do you think this book would be most relevant to? Who should be reading this book?
I think at this point in time, everyone should read this book, regardless of what your job is.
Right.
Just to sort of understand the level at which technology is infiltrated your life.
Yeah.
And
that
what
we're,
sort of
technically
processes...
growing, but not
so what sort of processes are actually
Yeah.
powering this technology and how they actually affect your life, which is something I think not too many people think about.
Absolutely.
They're just ready to accept whatever's happening.
Yeah.
And I just feel like it should be the other way around. Like right now, sort of we are pandering to the technology and we've put it on a pedestal.
Right.
Yeah.
But it should be technology that's sort of working for us and making our lives better instead of us trying to adapt to the technology.
Yeah. So maybe that awareness would
Yeah, I
bridge that
absolutely
gap.
think everyone should read this book. It's like a really important book.
Great.
So we'll be right back after a short break with Arun, and we're going to discuss a few more books.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please make sure you do. We are IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. As I mentioned over the last couple of weeks, we've been running a survey on our website. It's at ivmpodcast.com/survey. Please fill it out if you haven't already. And just so you guys know, there is a prize involved for the 25 people we will select at random, and we will send them an IVM Podcast mug. So this week on Cyrus Says, Cyrus's guest is Yash Bhanage, co-founder of Bombay Canteen in O Pedro. He talks about the intricacies of the F&B industry in India and the origins of his ventures. On Geek Fruit, Tejas, Dinkar and Janam talk about Netflix's latest series Russian Doll and why you should finish watching it right away. On Ganatantra, the hosts unpack how political violence works in India and why the absence of large-scale communal riots does not necessarily indicate social harmony. On Dale Harate, the hosts are joined by Rama Prasad, who translated the Amarush Shataka, a collection of love poems from Sanskrit to Kannada. He talks about the immortal nature of this work. On Football Twaddle, the hosts discuss the Kepa and Surrey incidents along with everything that happened in the Premier League. On the Habit Coach podcast, Ashton guides you through starting a sugarless life and the importance of substituting sugar with stevia. In the season finale of our Hindi show Cinemaya, Swati Bakshi is in conversation with Alankrita Srivastav, who discusses her journey from journalism to filmmaking and everything in between. And with that, let's continue with your show.
Hi guys, welcome back. We still have with us Arun Kale, founding editor of Helter, Skelter. Hi Arun. So the next book we're discussing is No Logo by Naomi Klien. So tell us what stood out about this book for you.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most sort of popular non-fiction books around. Like, I think the Guardian newspaper kind of listed it as number 3 in their top 100 non-fiction books of all time.
Right.
And I think she was trying to sort of start a revolution when the book came out. But I think a lot of the stuff she speaks about in the book are super relevant even today in terms of like how brands... So basically brands are a way of corporations to kind of put a personality and communicate with people.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's also used to kind of cover up a lot of vulgarity that happens in terms of mass marketing.
Right, okay.
So she's really broken down a lot of brands in terms of like, she really went after Nike in the book.
Okay.
And to the point where Nike actually had to put out a list of refuting her claims. They actually published their own list in response to the book.
Okay, wow.
Starbucks, a lot of these brands, because...
Gap,
I think that's super important to just sort of take a stand against this kind of, and especially now because of technology,
right?
Their sort of presence is even more pervasive.
Right.
What I find also really interesting about the book is like the kind of impact on pop culture it had. So, for example, like one of the bands are like the most like Radiohead, like their 4th and 5th albums, they've said that they've been inspired by this book.
Okay, wow, I didn't know that.
And they almost named they have an album called Kid A, which they almost were going to name No Logo before they settled on Kid A.
Wow.
So that kind of stuff, like, yeah, I mean, it's really a super influential book and also like 20 years later, still very relevant.
Still relevant today.
So do you reread it often or have you gone back to the book multiple times?
I don't usually reread books, but I mean, I go back to parts of it when they sort of come to me or when I think of them.
Or it connects
in response
to something.
Yeah.
Like, do you find that you see the same kind of takeaways in when you read many different books? Do you find that you find the same takeaways, but it's put in different perspectives?
I mean, I guess that depends on the book, and I guess also it depends on what I bring. I mean, readers bring something to the book,
right,
as well as writers. So, like, if both of us read the same book, your experience of it will be different from my experience of it because of our personal experiences, right?
Yeah, it's your understanding of the book.
Right. So the next book we're moving on to is the Expo Files by Stieg Larsson. So tell us about this book. What stood out for you? So Stieg Larsson is known best as the author of the Dragon Tattoo series.
Yeah, so the Millennium series.
Right.
He's also a journalist and
so he was a very respected journalist in Sweden, and he was very devoted and passionate about the kind of work he did. He wrote, actually, like the Millennium series, he thought of it as a series of 10 books.
Okay.
And he was only able to finish 3 before he passed away in 2004.
Right.
And they were published after his death. And I think they've sold more than 80 million copies worldwide. And now another author has kind of taken up the mantle and finishing the series.
The 10-book series.
But I think not a lot of people know about the journalist side of him.
Right.
Which was super interesting to see in this book, where he's very outspoken. So, I mean, people who've read the book kind of know the main character, Mikhail Blomkvist. So there's a lot of similarities between that character and
Stieg Larsson
in his real life in terms of just being super objective and even in terms of like everything has been documented very clearly.
Right.
He doesn't make any kind of false claims.
Right.
And this is like a collection of his essays and articles that he's written. So everything
I think it covers a lot of topics like racism and violence.
So everything from like right-wing extremism, he takes that on, racism, homophobia.
Right.
women's rights, violence against women. All of these topics are explored very brutally. I think it's the kind of book, I don't think you can sit and read the whole book in one go, because it's kind
Very
of hard
heavy.
hitting. And
Yeah.
but it's really powerful, and people should read these stories.
Yeah, also if you read like an article at a time, you can also reflect on it, and sort of it brings more relevance to you than just going at it at one go. Yeah.
So he was a publisher, I think, also in addition to being a writer.
Yeah, so the Expo Files, the title actually comes from, he was the editor-in-chief of a magazine called Expo.
Okay.
Which I think he started, so that's where the title of the book comes from. Yeah.
Great. So we're moving on to the next book, which is The Art of the Publisher by Roberto Calasso, sorry. So tell us about this book.
So this was actually recommended to me by a mathematician friend of mine who's also into philosophy. But I looked him up. He's written a lot of books. He's a writer and publisher of this really iconic publishing house called Adelphi in Italy. He knew a bunch of languages, everything like English, Spanish, Italian, German. He knew ancient Greek.
Wow.
Latin, Sanskrit as well.
Wow.
So like really well read. He was called, I think, a literary institution of one. So like a one-man army.
Amazing.
And so The Art of the Publisher was originally written in Italian but translated into English by Richard Dixon.
Okay.
And basically it just focuses on publishing as an art form on its own.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what makes a good publisher? What is a publisher in the first place?
Right.
It considers the publishing industry as a whole and just the making of books, and right from the history. So even publishers like right from the beginning, like Aldous Manutius, who kind of came up with the concept of a paperback.
Yeah.
Right.
Like a book that you can hold in your hand.
Right.
Like people, I mean, now we read books, we don't really think about how
it
books have
evolved over the years.
Because earlier books used to be like this really big things you couldn't really like
carry it around.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
To 400 years later, someone like Wolf, this German publisher, who later also created like a separate format of books during the World War and stuff like that. So
it's basically content in various formats, right? It went from
and also
to books
kind of what the soul of a publishing house is.
Right. It addresses
and
that.
how you sort of go about even taking on books. Like what books, why should a book be published, why should it not be published?
Right.
And also things like digitization of books now.
Right. Yeah.
And the consequences of that.
Okay.
And all of this. So it's not a very heavy book, it's like a short book, but I love even his style of writing is amazing. He makes really good points very succinctly and very cleverly, and he has like this really dry sense of humor which really comes through, and it's really enjoyable read actually.
So this,
in fact, in the book he mentioned, that there are a lot of publishers who do very distinct kind of books. So when you see the book, you can realize that which publishing house it belongs to. For example, for me, one of the publishers would be Faden, where I feel like they do a lot of books on art and architecture and fashion, and they have a very distinct style. Their cover pages are very, dynamic, bright, and still very different and eye-catching, I would say. So is there some publishing house like that which you are particularly fond of, or where you probably like the content that they put up, or just maybe how the book is as a package?
So Alexander Pushkin was like a very famous Russian poet and writer.
Okay.
And so Pushkin Press puts out a lot of really beautifully produced books from Russian authors, and a lot of them that I really enjoy. So and also instead of full-on collections of books, they also have just one-off stories just created beautifully.
Okay.
Right.
And I really love their books for sure.
Actually, this book gives a very positive picture of the publishing industry, as per my view. But in the past, we've dealt with, or rather interacted with, a lot of authors, and we've realized that the industry is not so author-centric. Like the, final product is something that comes out of somebody's various years of learning or, their experiences, and they do not get so much credit for the book that they actually write. So, have you had any experiences of that sort where you feel that, the authors are not being given the due credit by the industry today? It's almost about, well, you can't really, give it a number, but it's almost a 5,000 crore industry, and still we see that a large amount of authors are very unhappy. So do you think it's a pattern in the industry, or there's something we could do better? Or, you're an editor yourself, so what's your view on this?
In an ideal case scenario, like the publisher should actually help the book a lot, right from the editing process to producing like a really beautiful book that people want to buy.
Yeah.
But that does happen with especially with newer authors that maybe don't have like much of a following yet. That
it's difficult for them to
especially
penetrate
when it comes to, I think, the marketing side of the book.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a weird thing where they won't market it if they don't feel like it's popular enough, but it won't be popular enough
unless you market it.
Unless you market it.
So, yeah.
And also, I think a lot of authors also, like, even to combat this, they kind of do the promotion on their own.
Yeah.
But then there are things like the book doesn't reach the shop in time. So even if they're promoting the book, it's not
available
there in the
for
store
sale
yet.
in the bookstore.
Yeah.
Right.
So like if their friends want to buy it, it's not there yet, and then people forget about it.
Yeah.
So maybe even the publishing industry has something technically wrong. If we go back.
Like, I won't say wrong, but I don't know. Maybe there's some sense of apathy that sometimes comes in.
Right. Very interesting. And I think the last book we are moving on to is The Lonely City by Olivia Lang. What's this book about, Arun?
So I actually found this book recently when I was just randomly browsing through the internet, and I just, the title sort of caught me, like The Lonely City.
Right.
So this is written by Olivia Lang. She grew up in the UK, and in the mid-30s, after a bad relationship, she kind of moved to New York, and she just dealt with loneliness on a daily basis in a very profound way.
Okay.
And she was a writer, so she kind of started writing about it. But what I find really cool about this book is, like, so she juxtaposed her own experiences of what it means to be lonely, especially in urban spaces where everyone is so close to each other all the time.
Right.
And also sort of juxtapose them
yet
with...
so far, right?
Exactly, you can literally look into someone else's house. Our cities are so dense.
Yeah.
But at the same time also isolating.
Mm-hmm.
So like she looked at the works of artists like Edward Hopper, like Andy Warhol, Henry Darger and stuff like that. So just their work and how much their work explores the idea of loneliness in cities.
Right.
And also their own personal lives. And so she's also referenced a lot of interviews with the artists where they've been asked about these things, like how much does loneliness inform your work and stuff and like that, and how they feel in their own personal lives. Especially like the section on Edward Hopper I found really interesting, like his own relationship with his work and his relationship with his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that was it's really well written as well, so it doesn't feel like
reading about these heavy topics.
So it's just moving from one to the other, and it's really like nicely done, I feel.
Great. I think there's one last book you wanted to mention. Is you can tell us about it?
So Steering the Craft is this book about writing by Ursula K Liguin, who's I think my favorite author of all time.
Okay.
So she's written, like, obviously I don't think she needs an introduction, one of the greatest writers I think ever.
Right.
I think she passed away recently. She's usually referred to as a science fiction writer, but I think her writing kind of goes beyond any of that. Yeah. So Steering the Craft is a book she's written about writing, so it has a lot of her own experiences about being a writer.
Okay.
And very practical advice and suggestions to people who want to be serious about their writing.
Okay.
And what I like about it is, like, she's always super blunt, super direct, but not preachy.
Okay.
And she's been a writer, so kind of she relates her own experiences with stuff as well. So
Great.
Yeah, there's a line actually in the book which says that the chief duty of a narrative sentence is to keep the story going. And I think that's a wonderful tip for writing, because when I try to write articles, I realize that a lot of times you have to keep going. Even if you feel like maybe you're losing track or you're not making sense at that point, you can always come back to it. But that flow is something which is very important while you're writing. And in fact, so when I was reading about tips about writing, there was another point which was, which really stood out for me, which is that whenever you're writing and you decide to end the day, you should always leave a sentence incomplete, so that the next day when you go on to, going back to writing, you have something to start with. So your flow, basically, you keep the flow going.
Yeah, it's
which
super
is
practical.
Yeah. And
also, I think one thing I think younger writers sort of don't think enough about is the kind of technical side of writing.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot of people get into it because they feel like they're creative people and they want to express themselves, but there's a lot of technique that goes into it.
Yeah.
And especially like with the younger people, so they don't, for example, read as much as they should.
Right.
Yeah.
Or read as many kinds of writing as they should, and they don't kind of understand how to build something instead of just writing what comes in your head.
Yeah.
So I think books like this are super important especially for younger aspiring writers, to sort of just see how to construct something consciously.
Yeah, even the punctuation, grammar and all that she's mentioned. It's very
I'm
nicely
not even
written,
going into that, but like just the idea of the technique.
Yeah.
And that is important. I think people, should read it for that.
Great.
Absolutely.
That's a great one. Thank you, Arun Kale, for being with us today and sharing your insights on these books. We look forward to having you on the show again. You can follow Arun Kale at Sleepy by Day on Instagram. And a big thank you to all our listeners. You can follow the Open Library Project on LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook for latest updates on our events, and stay tuned for the next Paperback podcast on IVM Podcasts. Happy reading. You can follow IVM Podcast on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter at IVM Podcasts.
Hello everybody, we have a brand new daily podcast we're working on with Bloomberg Quint. All you need to know provides the top news on business, markets, and the economy so that you can stay ahead of the curve. Tune in every morning on BloombergQuint.com, the IVM podcast app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Every week comes a show where three people come together to tell you about stuff they like. A movie, a TV show, a book, and other stuff. Tune in every Monday on the IVM Podcast app to IVM Likes. Batman approves this message. Thank you, Batman.